Let me tell you how it began. Not with a warning, not with sirens, not with politicians behind podiums or scientists huddled in labs staring at glowing screens. It started with the sky, screaming, not metaphorically, not poetically. It screamed, a sound so deep, so low, it bypassed your ears and settled into your bones. People looked up not because they were curious, but because something ancient inside them panicked. It was the same instinct that once made our ancestors run from shadows and tall grass. Above the glittering skyline of New Santiago, the air cracked. A jagged wound split the clouds, and from that fissure spilled something darker than space. Not just black, hungry, like it wanted to consume the stars themselves. At first, no one understood. The first few seconds looked like an aurora gone wrong. Beautiful, terrifying. People recorded it, laughed nervously, live-streamed. Then the light shifted. The clouds parted like torn paper, and something crawled through. The first of them, whatever they were, didn't fly. They fell, long, skeletal shapes, like predatory sculptures made of bone and fire. No ships, no engines, no warning, just motion. A cascade of alien nightmares diving headfirst into our atmosphere, igniting like meteors. One slammed into the Pacific, another into the sprawl of Eastern Europe, the third right through the heart of Johannesburg. And then the world held its breath. For a moment, just a second, like we all collectively waited for someone, anyone, to explain. But the sky didn't stop screaming. It roared louder. They weren't ships. They weren't probes. They weren't emissaries. They were hunters, and they had found us. The official term the UN used was First Contact Hostile, for syllables stripped of fear, polished in military marble. But in the streets, people called them what they looked like, the Reapers. They didn't shoot lasers, didn't negotiate. They landed and ripped, steel and bone, teeth like obsidian, limbs that twisted too far, moved too fast. Cities fell in hours, not because we were weak, but because we weren't ready. Nothing in our collective storybook prepared us for monsters that walked like shadows and howled like machinery dying. Sao Paulo was the first to go silent, then Delhi, then Munich. By the time the global feeds caught up, a quarter of Earth's major cities were either on fire or already buried in their own rubble. In one haunting broadcast, a drone feed over Lagos, you could see them, these towering creatures, moving through streets like gods in a thunderstorm, not destroying for tactics, for pleasure. Every frame a painting of chaos, glass raining like confetti, people running, then not, and then static. On the third day, Earth sent its voice into orbit, a last message from the International Defense Council, a mosaic of faces, tired, proud, breaking. They didn't beg, they didn't offer peace, they just told the truth. This is not an invasion, it's an extinction. The words echoed across every screen. And for a moment, just a breath, it felt like the end had already arrived. People cried, prayed, fought each other for food, locked their doors, and whispered goodbyes. But not everyone. Somewhere in the ruins of what was once Houston, a soldier named Aaron Curry, battered, blood on his face, voice barely more than a growl, grabbed a broken military comm and spat into the open channel, then let extinction bleed. It wasn't a call to arms. It was a promise. That single sentence, 5 words, spread faster than the enemy. It hit the underground feeds, lit up abandoned servers like fire in a frozen cave. It crawled into the hearts of the broken, the desperate, the furious. People tattooed it on their arms, sprayed it across rubble, etched it into walls with broken glass, let extinction bleed. And just like that, the world stopped dying quietly. The first counterstrike wasn't military. It was personal. In the smoldering remains of Kyoto, a father who had lost everything, wife, child, home, strapped explosives to himself and walked into a Reaper nest. He killed 16 of them. 16. One man. They found footage from his helmet cam. His last words were simple, "For my daughter's laugh." In Paris, underground radio technicians rigged a museum's broadcast tower and sent out a loop of Beethoven's Ninth. For hours, it echoed through what was left of the city, a symphony against the silence, a melody that, somehow, made the monsters hesitate. And in Cape Town, school children, barely 10 years old, used toy drones to drop homemade firebombs on alien patrols. They called it tag, you're dead. We weren't soldiers, we were human, and that was enough to piss the universe off. By the end of the first week, Humanity had stopped collapsing. We started adapting. Scavengers turned into guerrillas, mechanics into tacticians, hackers into warlords of code. We didn't have fleets. We didn't have orbital superiority, but we had rage. We had memories. We had stories that reminded us we don't go down without a fight. We were the species that crawled out of caves, that tamed fire, that built skyscrapers just to look down at the stars. And now, the stars were looking down at us, and they didn't like what they saw. Somewhere in the Arctic Circle, a hidden observatory recorded something the rest of the world missed. One of the Reaper motherships pausing mid-dive. It hovered, twitching, watching, as if unsure. You could almost feel it thinking, why aren't they breaking? Why are they fighting like this? The answer? Because we don't know how not to. And there, in the wreckage, humanity began to change. We didn't rebuild. Not yet. We transformed. Abandoned subway systems became bunkers. Malls turned into blacksmith forges for makeshift armor. Engineers rewired dead satellites into orbital tripwires. Children grew up learning how to disarm alien explosives before they learned algebra. Even in grief, we adapted. Even in ruin, we remembered. Some nights, when the fires died down, people would gather around shattered screens or burn-out transmitters. Someone would tell a story, not of how the world ended, but of how someone fought. The mother who ran back into a hospital to save strangers. The old man who taught his neighborhood to fight with garden tools. The scientist who stayed behind to transmit alien weaknesses even as her lab fell around her. Each story a matchstick, a flicker of light in the dark. And together, they made a fire the stars couldn't ignore. So yes, the sky screamed first. It howled. It burned. It rained death and horror and things no human mind was ever meant to see. But it didn't break us. It warned us. Because this wasn't just a war. This was our legend being written. Line by line, drop by drop, burn by burn. We were fragile. We were scared. But we were still here. And we weren't going anywhere quietly. Let me take you to the moment Earth stopped playing defense. We'd been ducking, bleeding, burying too many names, too fast, in too shallow graves. The Reapers were winning. If you could even call it winning. What they were doing wasn't conquest. It was removal, like we were a stain on their cosmic blueprint. Something they needed to wipe clean, efficiently, without emotion. But here's the thing: no war god, no hyper-intelligent hive, no precision-bred monster ever really understood about us. You push a human far enough, we don't shatter. We ignite. They called it Operation Firewalk. Unofficially, it had a different name, passed in whispers through the refugee tunnels and comms chatter. Dead Man's Ladder. Because no one expected to return. And every step they climbed toward the stars, they did it knowing they weren't coming back down. 60 volunteers. Not elite. Not special forces. Just people. Mechanics. Ex-Marines. Cargo pilots. A violinist from Melbourne who watched her conservatory collapse under a Reaper worm. They weren't chosen for skills. They were chosen because they refused to stay grounded. Because when humanity looked at the biggest, ugliest, most terrifying thing in the sky, these 60 souls said, "Put me on it." The target? A Zerkel dreadform. A behemoth orbiting Earth like a black cathedral of nightmares. Part machine, part organism. Bristling with spike limbs and hive towers. A living factory of war. It had no name, no insignia, just presence. It loomed. Every time we launched evac ships, it turned them to ash. Every time we sent drones, it hijacked them mid-transmission and sent them back in pieces. It wasn't a ship. It was a god killer, floating judgment, and we were going to punch it in the face. The plan? Simple on paper. Strip down a mining freighter, weld on improvised drop pods and magnetic boots, load it with every explosive we could get our bruised hands on, and fly it straight into the thing's spinal column. A suicide run. Except, humanity doesn't die that quietly. They launched at 0400, under the flicker of a broken aurora. The sky still scarred from the Reaper tear that hadn't closed since day one. There were no parades, no speeches, just handshakes, a few muttered jokes, and a single line scratched into the launch bay wall. "If we don't make it back, make it matter." Then the ship, call sign Chariot Red, rose on repurposed engines and roared into the dark. The footage we got back was grainy, static choked, but unforgettable. You see them inside, faces lit by red emergency glow, hands gripping rails, eyes steel hard. Not terrified, not brave, just ready. There's a moment where one of them, An old Afghan engineer named Reza pulls a photo out of his vest. His daughter, lost in Kabul. He looks into the camera, not smiling, not crying, just calm. And he says, "Tell them we were people." They reached the dread form in 26 minutes. And the dread form noticed. It turned, twisted in space like a serpent waking, hulls folding, tendrils writhing, weapons warming up. But Chariot Red didn't flinch. It slammed into the beast like a spear into the ribs of a god. And then they went in. Inside the dread form, nothing made sense. The walls weren't metal. They pulsed, like veins. Gravity flickered. Air was a hallucination. But they didn't stop. 60 humans, guns drawn, teeth clenched, moving like ants through a dragon's heart. The first firefight was chaos. Creatures spilled from the shadows. Not soldiers, ecosystems, crawling death, skittering walls, things that looked like they'd been born screaming. But we didn't scream back. We fought. Not clean, not pretty. Guns jammed, people bit, bones cracked, grenades went off too close. Oxygen tanks ruptured. One woman, Maria, former London firefighter, smashed an alien skull in with a severed pipe and shouted, "I used to put out fires. Now I am one." They carved their way up the spine of the beast, room by room, nerve by nerve, planting charges, leaving messages, making noise. One soldier, in blood from both sides, spray painted a single phrase on a hive wall before moving on. "We see you. We fear nothing." By the time they reached the Dreadform's core, only 21 were still breathing, and not one of them hesitated. The core was alive, like staring into a brain that dreamed of genocide. It pulsed with light, thought, hunger. And in that chamber, the last humans standing gathered in a circle, weapons raised, backs against each other. They didn't pray, didn't plea. They smiled. One muttered, "Now this is heavy metal." Then they pulled the trigger. The explosion was seen from the North Pole, a blooming nova in low orbit, red and gold and screaming. For the first time since the war began, the Reapers stopped mid-march, froze, twitched. Something in their hive mind blinked. Their dread form, indestructible, untouchable, was gone. Burning wreckage rained through the upper atmosphere. Alien pieces fell like forgotten gods. And across every underground channel, every hidden feed, every soldier's HUD, one message broadcast. Short, simple, final, objective complete. "We made you notice." That line became gospel, tattooed on arms, scratched onto rifles, whispered before combat. "We made you notice." Because that's what this was, wasn't it? The war wasn't about territory. It wasn't even about survival. It was about identity. We weren't just food, or insects, or collateral. We were people, and we had teeth. After Firewalk, something changed. The enemy didn't become weaker, but we became louder. And when you're facing something that feeds on silence, loudness is its own kind of weapon. Every outpost started fighting harder. Every cell of the resistance started dreaming bigger. And every time the Reapers thought Earth was done, they remembered the Dreadform burning. They remembered 60 nobodies with a freighter and a vendetta. And they hesitated. Historians would one day call it the spark. The moment the war turned from survival to defiance, a line was drawn in the stars, not with ink, not with flags, but with blood and fire, and the echo of a species that refuses to go quietly. So when they ask you how humanity answered extinction, don't tell them about the weapons. Tell them about Chariot Red. Tell them about the 60. Tell them about a species born in mud, raised on grief, and forged in fire. Tell them we made them notice. And sometimes, that's all it takes to start a revolution. You ever hear the sound of hope? It doesn't always come with trumpets or theme music. Sometimes, it's static on a broken radio, a half-sentence whispered through blood-crackled comms, a spark of something real in the middle of everything that's trying to kill you. Hope came to us in the form of a signal, not a speech, not a mission briefing, just a moment, a glimpse of what humans do when we're supposed to be dust. The mission called Firewalk was supposed to be one and done, a suicide play, a closing chapter. 60 went up, 21 made it to the core, 0 came home, but their message did, and that changed everything. See, deep in the orbit wreckage, floating somewhere between dead satellites and alien debris, was a relay drone. Just a dumb, outdated machine patched together from Cold War tech and salvaged Martian comms. Nobody expected it to survive. Nobody knew it had even launched. But there it was, still drifting, still blinking, still transmitting. For 22 hours straight, it played back the helmet footage from Chariot Red. Fragmented, jittery, bleeding light, through every pixel. But the message was clear. Humans made it aboard. Humans made it to the heart. Humans made it hurt. And they left their mark. It started small. A scattered refugee flotilla near Ganymede picked up the feed. They'd been hiding in asteroid shadows for weeks, barely clinging to life, eating recycled paste, and praying the Reapers wouldn't notice their heat signatures. The footage played on a cracked holoscreen in the mess bay. At first, they thought it was old war footage, but then they saw the timestamp. Then they heard the voice. Kane's voice, grit in his throat, fire in his chest. "We're the last thing you'll ever remember." And someone in the room just whispered, "They did it." Someone else laughed through tears. And for the first time in weeks, no one felt alone. The feed spread like wildfire. Pirate satellites hijacked it. Signal leeches rebroadcast it across the black. Hackers stitched it into entertainment streams, underground marketplaces, weather updates. Even a few old-world news anchors, holed up in bunkers with no audience but ghosts, played it live. And it kept coming. Helmet cams, battle logs, body vitals ticking down one by one. Real people, real sacrifice, real proof. Suddenly, we weren't just stories around campfires. We were witnesses. Resistance cells, once isolated and gasping for morale, began to sync up. Groups in Singapore made contact with miners in the Andes. Pacific scavenger fleets started talking to orbital junkers off Neptune's belt. And everywhere, someone said the same thing. They're not invincible. We started seeing them differently. The Reapers, not as unstoppable, not as gods, but as something that can be made to bleed. Because once you've seen one of their titans crack open from the inside, its black flesh peeling in fire, screaming into space like a wounded animal, it's hard to be scared of the same shadows again. It wasn't just courage that came back. It was clarity. People started asking, why? Why did they need us dead? Why didn't they speak? Offer terms. Explain. We combed through the wreckage of the dread form. What little of it made landfall. Not much was usable. Most of it was either vaporized or still dangerously alien, like it was rejecting being understood. But buried inside one twisted shard of organic metal, a group of exoanalysts found something strange. A signal, not language, not code, a frequency, low, erratic, repeating like a heartbeat, and laced within it, something no one expected. Fear. It wasn't obvious at first, just a rhythm, a pulse that didn't match any tactical pattern. But after enough analysis, one message became clear. The hive was in pain. Something had reached into its spine and broken it. And the pieces, whatever was left of its neural matrix, were broadcasting not dominance, but panic. Let that settle in for a second. The enemy, the thing that burned our cities, slaughtered billions, tore through continents like tissue paper, was afraid of us. Not because of numbers, not because of power, because of what we did when we were cornered. Because we didn't beg, because we bit back, because even with the entire sky falling, we ran into the fire. Scientists called it emotional transference. Tacticians called it tactical confusion. Old soldiers just smiled, lit a cigarette, and muttered. They didn't think rats could chew through the hull. And just like that, a new kind of war began. One made of shadows and static. One where information became more powerful than nukes. We didn't need to match them in strength. We just needed to show each other who we really were. In the tunnels of broken London, kids spray-painted murals of the Firewalk team. Flames behind them, Reaper corpses at their feet. In the irradiated shell of Chicago, a scavenger group hacked an old sports stadium and played the helmet footage on a loop across the Jumbotron, screaming every time a Reaper got torn in half. In orbit, rebel drone pilots named their ships after the 60. Each call sign a memory. Kane, 2. Valdez, 7. Reza, 9. And across all channels, one phrase echoed louder than gunfire. They're not gods. They bleed. That message, it turned suicides into strategies, survivors into soldiers, loneliness into unity. People started organizing without being asked, started fighting without being told, not because they were trained, because they refused to be erased. And that resistance, it wasn't led by governments anymore. They were gone. It wasn't led by generals. Most of them were dust. It was led by memory, by defiance, by a bunch of nobodies who became heroes when the sky screamed. One of the captured signals from a Reaper scout, decoded weeks later, revealed a terrifying truth. They thought we would fold in a matter of days. They thought we'd surrender our weapons, our people, our souls. Instead, they got a boot on their throat and a burning freighter inside their skull. And what came next was louder, bigger, bolder, because once hope wakes up in the human heart, you can't silence it. You can't kill it. You can only pray it doesn't come for you next. So when they ask you what turned the tide, tell them it wasn't missiles, or war plans, or quantum algorithms. It was 60 people, one mission, and a signal that lit up the dark. Tell them we showed our scars and made them fear our strength. Tell them that in the ruins, when all seemed lost, we found each other again. There are moments in history when the sky turns red, not from sunsets, not from storms, from blood, from fire, from something worse coming. They called it the Blood Horizon, because when the Zerkel retaliated, they didn't come back with ships. They came back with monsters. Let's rewind, just a little. By this point, humanity had begun fighting back, not just surviving, hurting them. Firewalk had shattered the myth of Reaper invincibility, and we were starting to believe again, starting to hope. That's what made what happened next hurt even more. The first sighting came from a long-range patrol off the Martian colonies. Standard recon sweep, 3 ships, low orbit, nothing fancy. They were looking for leftover wreckage to salvage. Maybe a crashed scout drone, maybe a signal fragment. Instead, they saw it, a silhouette, moving across the polar ice caps. Tall, towering, wrong. One of the pilots sent a quick transmission, just 6 words. It's not a ship, it walks. Then everything went black. They were called world enders. No other name really worked. They weren't vehicles. They weren't alive in any way that made sense. They were gargantuan, lumbering masses of biomechanical horror, each one the size of a skyscraper, made of bone, muscle, metal, rage, and hunger. You couldn't fight them with guns. You couldn't outfly them. You couldn't even outrun them. They came down like meteors, and when they stood up, entire cities vanished. The first one to hit Earth landed outside Johannesburg. By the time the dust cleared, there was nothing left but a crater and silence. 17 square kilometers gone. No buildings, no screams, just red dust curling into a sky that wasn't sure how to cry anymore. Then came the second, and the third, and the fourth. Different continents. Same story. They didn't coordinate. They descended, like extinction had just taken form and started walking. And here's the thing. They weren't just killing. They were sending a message. Everywhere they stepped, they left behind black towers, spires of twisted matter, pulsing with that same frequency we'd picked up from the Dreadform wreckage. Fear, corruption, control. We were learning what real psychological warfare looked like. And it was tall, slow, unstoppable, and patient. People cracked. The strongest bunkers folded under their weight. Missiles barely scratched them. And when we tried nukes, they adapted, learned, grew. One commander screamed over open comms before his line went dead. It's not dying. It's evolving. The blood horizon crept forward. Not a sudden wave. A slow, deliberate crawl. Red dust choking the wind. Ash falling like snow. Skies tinted crimson from the sheer heat and destruction in the atmosphere. The world felt cursed, as if Earth itself had been marked. Not for conquest anymore, for execution. But even in the middle of all that dread, all that death, humanity still fought. It was different now. No more front lines. No more battles as we used to know them. This was trench warfare in the Age of Titans. Sabotage missions that read like suicide notes. Survivors whispering strategies in underground mazes of concrete and hope. And in one place, we didn't just survive. We stood. Mars. You've heard the story, right? The last colony. The Red Bastion. It wasn't much, really. A shield dome. A few thousand soldiers. A scattered civilian population living beneath frozen dirt and artificial lights. But what it lacked in strength, it made up for in soul. The Reapers sent a world ender, their biggest yet, came down like judgment. They thought Mars would fall like the rest. They were wrong. The defense was led by Captain Ana Valdez, former Special Forces, lost her brother in the fall of Madrid, watched her wife disintegrated during the second wave over Rio. She had no illusions left, just one belief. If the monster's coming, then it chokes on us. The Martian archives still have the footage. It's haunting and beautiful. A single, lone woman in red battle armor, standing atop the command tower. The creature, this towering colossus of hate, moving toward her in the distance. Each footstep shattering mountains. Anna didn't run. She keyed her comm, all frequencies, every channel, and said to anyone listening, "This isn't a call for help. This is our line in the sand. We won't win, but we'll matter. Make sure they remember that. She triggered the failsafe, a buried fusion core the size of a battleship, a final gift from Earth's dying space program. It burned white, blinded the skies. The creature tried to flee. Too late. Anna's sacrifice turned the entire valley into glass. And when the dust settled, the world ender was down. Its black heart, still twitching, cracked open like a rotten seed. And the message spread. They can fall. Mars didn't die that day. It stood. And in the Resistance's darkest hours, that meant everything. Back on Earth, the Red Bastion's stand sparked a shift. Not in firepower, in mindset. People saw the monster fall, and they started believing in impossible things again. That you didn't need to win every fight. You just had to make the cost unbearable. That became the new doctrine. Make them pay. We started laying traps. Booby-trapped skyscrapers wired with chemical accelerants. Train tunnels lined with shaped charges. Whole ghost towns turned into honeycombed kill zones. We knew we couldn't outmuscle them, so we outthought them, outbled them, outrefused to die. And somewhere along the way, they began hesitating. Their movements got less bold. Their dropships circled longer before landing. Their harvesters didn't linger. They still burned, still killed, still walked across the world like it was theirs. But now they were watching us back, like predators realizing their prey had teeth. And those black spires they left behind? Yeah, we started blowing them up. Hackers turned the frequencies back on them. Engineers rewired the pulse tech to fry Reaper nervous systems. One rebel cell in Berlin managed to reprogram a spire to loop Beethoven's Fifth. They called it Symphony of Spite. The enemy tried to destroy it. They failed. It was a small victory, but small meant something now. Small meant human. There's a phrase scratched into the wall of the Mumbai catacombs. They say no one knows who wrote it, but everyone who passes reads it. Over and over. The blood horizon is real, but so is what stands behind it. So when the skies turn red and the monsters come walking again, don't look away. Look back. To Mars. To Anna. To every soul who burned so we could still be here. Because the blood on the horizon, it's not just ours anymore. We've made sure of that. Some wars are fought on the ground. Boots in the mud. Blood on the rubble. Screams lost to the wind. But some wars happen in the sky, where silence is a weapon, where velocity replaces courage, where every mistake ends with your name written in smoke, drifting into the void. This is the story of those who took the fight above the clouds, those who stopped being soldiers and became ashes in orbit. After Mars burned and stood tall, the Reapers changed tactics again. They always adapted. That was their strength. They evolved as fast as we bled. And now, they wanted the stars. They began seeding Earth's orbit with death. Drifters, bone-fused satellites, AI-controlled kill webs, and auto-launched torpedoes the size of freight trains. A cage, not to trap us, to isolate us, cut off supplies, kill every shuttle before liftoff, snuff out any flicker of rebellion trying to reach space. And slowly, silently, the sky became a graveyard. But humans are stubborn creatures. We look up at walls and start looking for cracks. We don't stop at no. We sharpen it into why not. And so, buried beneath the jagged remains of old Havana, someone found it. An old prototype, Cold War era, a broken-down orbital interceptor built during Earth's last civil conflict. It was called Wraith 1, only one ever made. It was never tested, never flown, no manual, no backup, but it still had engines. And one cracked AI core still whispering old code into the dark. Enter Commander Yelena Voss, test pilot, war orphan. She flew her first drone at 13, stole her first plane at 15. By 25, she'd been shot down twice, broke both legs once, and earned the nickname Gravestone because anything she flew either crashed hard or came back with bodies in its wake. When she found Wraith 1, she didn't ask for permission. She didn't wait for a team. She walked into the rusted hangar, ran a hand across the ancient carbon plating, and whispered, "You and me, then." They rebuilt it in secret, piece by scavenged piece, wrapped in duct tape, fused with alien alloy, patched together with human desperation and Martian ingenuity. No one thought it would work, but no one stopped her, because when you've got nothing left to lose, you don't bet. You burn. She named it Ashwing because she knew what she was becoming. Not a pilot, a spark in the void. The first test flight wasn't a test. She launched straight through enemy orbit, riding a dead man's flight path, using the wreckage of fallen satellites as cover. Inside the cockpit, Her vitals were spiking. Heart at 172 BPM. Oxygen low. HUD flickering with ghost code. And yet, she danced, like the sky still belonged to us. She tore through a Reaper kill web like a scythe through silk, dropped 2 torpedoes into their relay hub, screamed her call sign into the void. Gravestone is airborne, and vanished into black before their systems could even lock. It was the first orbital kill in 6 months, and it cracked something open in humanity's chest. Not hope, spite. Suddenly, people started digging up everything with wings. Old space gliders, decommissioned shuttles, experimental craft left to rot in lunar caves. If it had a cockpit and thrusters, it flew. If it didn't, we built wings for it anyway. And so, the Ashen Flight was born. Not a formal squadron, not a military unit, just ghosts with guns, pilots with vendettas, people too haunted to live on the ground anymore. Each of them knew the math. You launch, you probably don't come back. But they did it anyway, because the sky had been taken from us, and they wanted it back. They flew with no formation, no protocol, just purpose. Sometimes they used signal scramblers and alien cloaks. Sometimes they flew through asteroid fields and let the rocks do the talking. One of them, codenamed Drifter Queen, dropped a nuke inside a Reaper Hive ship by slingshotting around the moon. Did she survive? Nobody knows. But the explosion lit up the eastern sky like a sunrise made of vengeance. People started watching the skies again, not for monsters, for trails of fire. You'd see one cut across the clouds, thin, bright, impossibly fast. And someone, somewhere, would say, "Ashwing's up." It was never clear who was in that one. Maybe Yelena, maybe someone else flying her ghost. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that we still had wings. The Reapers began deploying orbital sentinels, heavily shielded, biosynced anti-air behemoths. Massive, brutal, programmed to destroy anything above 30,000 feet. The first one took out 3 resistance shuttles in under 2 minutes. But we don't fold. We adapt. One pilot, call sign Zero Fox, volunteered to draw its fire. Didn't even load weapons. Just bolted together an engine, 2 wings, and a cockpit. He launched straight at the thing, juking, spinning, dodging flak. He got hit, took damage, kept flying. You can hear his last transmission, still archived on Rebel channels. "I'll be the decoy, you be the knife." And the rest of Ashen Flight came in from behind, slicing through the Reaper node like blades through rot. By the time it fell, Zero Fox was gone, but his smoke trail was still spiraling through the clouds. Every kill we made in orbit didn't just buy time. It sent a message, not to the Reapers, to us, that the stars weren't theirs, that gravity was just a dare, that even in vacuum and silence, humanity could howl. People on the ground would listen for the sonic booms. Children would draw streaks in the sky with sticks in the dirt. In bunkers, people named babies after pilots they'd never met. Ash, Voss, Grave, Sky. Names that reminded us that fire doesn't die in the cold. It flares. One day, an old salvager recovered a flight recorder from a downed Reaper vessel. Inside was the enemy's attempt to categorize Ashen Flight. They didn't call us pilots. They didn't call us soldiers. They called us atmospheric anomalies, uncontainable, unpredictable, emotional vectors. Emotional vectors. Imagine that. To creatures who don't feel, emotion was a weapon they couldn't decode, a threat they couldn't quantify. We made rage aerodynamic. We turned loss into lift. We made grief go supersonic. And we wrote our names in the stars with afterburn and ash. Ashwing was last seen streaking over the shattered rings of Saturn. Still flying, still fighting, still free. No one knows if Yelena's still alive. Maybe she went out on her terms. Maybe she's out there somewhere, a ghost with fire in her bones. But people still watch the skies, still squint at streaks, still whisper, "Gravestone never lands." So when they ask you if we still own the skies, tell them about Ashwing. Tell them about the Ashen Flight. Tell them that even in orbit, where silence is the only sound, humanity made itself heard. We weren't just fighting for Earth anymore. We were carving scars into the heavens, and the stars would never forget us. By now, most of Earth was no longer Earth. It had become something else, a graveyard of cities, a map of scorch marks and scars. Oceans boiled, skies cracked, continents folded in on themselves like clenched fists. But beneath all that destruction, under the ash and the glass and the silence, Humanity was still digging. The war in orbit had bought us time. Not much, just enough for the survivors to breathe, regroup, think. We couldn't win in space. Not yet. So we turned inward. Literally, we went underground. It wasn't a strategy. Not at first. It was desperation. People fled beneath the surface, chasing tunnels like veins, hoping rock would do what steel and sky had failed to do, keep them alive. And somehow it did. For a while, you'd be amazed what people built in the dark. Cities carved into mountainsides, underground rivers tapped for hydropower, light domes made of cracked solar glass and salvaged alien tech. Some were barely holding on. Others were thriving, quietly, secretly. And in one of those places, something changed. It happened in the former Nordic sectors, beneath what used to be Norway. Deep under the permafrost, a mining colony turned refugee hub uncovered something during a geothermal excavation. They weren't looking for salvation. They were just trying to stay warm. But they hit metal. Not human, not Reaper. Older. No one knows who found it first. Wasn't a soldier. Wasn't a scientist. Just some nameless digger working off ration credits. One day, her drill jammed. She cleared the frost and saw a curve. Smooth. Cold. Impossible. Not a machine. Not a cave. A door. We don't know what opened it. Maybe it responded to touch, or to heat, or maybe it had been waiting. Either way, the wall split, and what lay beyond rewrote everything we thought we understood about this war. They called it the Vein, a subterranean network stretching across half a continent. Organic, metallic, dormant, but alive. Not Reaper tech. Older, meaner, and human? No, not even close. But it wasn't hostile either. It was witnessing. The first team inside vanished. Standard protocol. Second team went in with pulse tracers and auto recorders. They made it halfway through. Their footage came back scrambled, except for one 13-second clip. A single line of audio, layered over darkness. They were afraid of this. That was enough to send in Special Division 9, the best we had left in the field. Not generals, not suits, just warriors and thinkers and survivors. People who'd seen the sky burn and still had something left to give. Leading the team was Elias Grant, former Reaper Tech analyst. Lost his left arm during the siege of Tokyo. Didn't replace it with standard gear. He grafted alien tech into the stump himself. People thought he was crazy. They weren't wrong. But in war, crazy sometimes wins. Elias took a crew of 5. No names in the records. Just call signs. Spindle, Holt, Wren, Bricks, and Shade. If those names don't mean anything to you, that's because they were meant to disappear. This wasn't a mission. It was an unspoken burial party. Either bury the secret or get buried with it. The vein pulsed like a heartbeat. Not regular, not rhythmic, just aware. It didn't speak. But the further they went in, the more they felt it. Like a presence pressing behind their eyes. Memories they didn't have. Nightmares they'd never dreamed. One of them said, "It's not showing us the future. It's remembering something through us." And then they found it. The heart of the vein. A chamber. Cold. Massive. Hollowed out like the ribcage of a god. Floating at the center. A sphere. Black. Smooth. Cracked. It was bleeding light. And all around it, pinned to the walls, frozen in stasis, were shapes. Twisted. Burned. Not human. Not Reaper. Something else. We don't know what they were. The Reapers feared them, and whatever had built the vein had fought them first, and won. Elias made the call. We don't bury this. We wake it up. The team activated the core. How? We still don't know. Elias fed it a fragment of Reaper neural code, something he'd pulled from a drone years ago, like a puzzle piece forced into a lock that didn't fit until it did. The sphere pulsed, and something inside it screamed. Not loud, not physical, a psychic howl that shattered eardrums, cracked helmets, fried 3 of their implants on the spot. And then silence. When Elias and his team stumbled out 2 days later, the vein had changed. It was glowing now, faint lines of red and violet running like blood through black stone. And above them, the Reapers were pulling back. Not everywhere, but enough. Enough to notice. Enough to wonder, did we just wake up their ancient enemy? Or did we just become it? 1 week later, a world ender came for the vein, dropped from orbit, straight into Norway's crust. The impact registered across continents. Earthquakes, tsunamis, a mushroom cloud of ice and dirt. People thought the vein was gone. It wasn't. A day after impact, satellite feeds, patched together from busted drones and repurposed security cams, captured something insane. The world ender slowing down, then stopping, then sinking, as if the ground beneath it opened its mouth and swallowed it whole. To this day, We don't know what happened under there. But the monster never came back. And the vein? It's still glowing. And now it's growing. Elias hasn't been seen since. His team either. But before he vanished, he left one last transmission. It looped for 17 hours on every rebel frequency across the planet. 5 words. We're not the first war. Let that sink in, because it reframes everything. We thought we were fighting for survival. But maybe, just maybe, we were stepping into the middle of something much older, much larger. A war not of species, but cycles. And maybe humanity wasn't the target. We were the trigger. There's a wall deep beneath the vein now, carved in steel by the survivors who kept digging even after the Reaper fell. On it, etched in a dozen languages, are the same 5 words. No context, no names, just the truth. We're not the first war. So when they ask you how we buried a Reaper, tell them we didn't dig a grave. We dug up a warning. And now, the ground remembers. There's a kind of silence in space that doesn't exist anywhere else. It's not the silence of peace or rest. It's the silence of watching. Like the universe is holding its breath. Like the stars know something you don't. And if you stare long enough, if you listen, you begin to feel it, too. That uneasy stillness. That ancient weight. That sense that something is missing. They call it the Hollow Belt now. A stretch of space between Neptune and the Kuiper Edge, once filled with rogue asteroids and forgotten probes. Now, it's empty, not just cleared, not destroyed, drained, as if something passed through and took more than matter. It took meaning, like the belt used to belong to someone. And now no one. The first to notice were the scavengers, junk haulers, old space miners, orbital rats who lived off what the old world left behind. One of them, callsign Quill, sent the first warning. Simple, barely audible, transmitted on a dead channel used by a Martian relay that hadn't buzzed in years. Don't come out here. The stars aren't right. Then silence. No signal. Just gone. People ignored it at first. Ghost stories. Cosmic paranoia. The kind of thing you expect when you stare into the black too long. But then more went missing. 10 ships. Then 20. All gone dark between orbital markers. No wreckage. No distress calls. Just nothing. As if they'd slipped into another reality. One that didn't bother leaving a trace. It was Elias' final message that pushed us to look deeper. You remember the one. We're not the first war. The vein hadn't just woken up. It had pointed, and the direction? Dead center into the hollow belt. So we sent someone. Not a fleet. Not a battalion. Just one person. Because we knew if something was out there, fleets wouldn't matter. We needed eyes. We needed someone reckless enough to go alone. Her name was Cora Wren. Pilot. Cartographer. Signal junkie. Raised in the upper levels of the Tethys spires, surrounded by star maps and rumors. People said she could read constellations like other people read poetry. She didn't believe in ghosts, but she believed in questions. And this was the biggest question of all. She took a solo craft, driftglass, bare bones, 1 engine, 1 life support system, 2 weeks of oxygen, no weapons, just scanners, recorders, and 1 patched together AI named Noonlight. No one expected her back, not even Cora. The last human ship to cross into the belt had vanished in under 6 minutes. She made it 22, and what she saw broke everything. The recordings are scattered, fragmented, half corrupted by radiation, half redacted by Resistance command. But some pieces slipped through. 1 clip, just 7 seconds long, shows her looking through the viewport, eyes wide, breath caught in her throat, whispering, "They're not stars." Zoom in, and you see it. The stars around her ship aren't stars at all. They move, drift, shift, pulse with eerie regularity. Not like celestial bodies, like organisms, massive, ancient, dormant, and worse. Each of them is shaped like a spine, long, jagged, coiled around nothing, as if something once wrapped itself around these invisible points in space and never uncurled. Then came the sound, a low thrum, bone deep, like gravity humming out of tune. Not a voice, but a presence. Cora's vitals spiked, heart rate surged, blood pressure dropped. Noonlight reported neurological interference. Memories not her own flooding her mind. Images of burning skies, shattered planets, creatures made of starlight and hunger. And always, always, those spines, curling, stretching, watching. In her last coherent log, Cora said this: "They aren't coming. They're already here, sleeping inside the dark. The Reapers aren't the threat. They're the fuse." Then Driftglass was gone, just like the rest. But Cora had 1 trick left, a failsafe. Before crossing the inner edge of the hollow, she launched a recorder buoy. Old tech, hardwired and shielded against every known Reaper signal. It tumbled back across space for 6 days, half dead, but it made it. And what it carried rewrote the war. You've probably seen the broadcast, even if you don't know it. It's been chopped into propaganda reels, whispered through resistance radios, buried in rebel graffiti from Prague to Phobos. A single sentence, echoed in a whisper that doesn't quite sound human. The stars remember, and they are not merciful. That was the shift, the moment the war turned existential. Because suddenly, the Reapers weren't the top of the food chain. They were messengers, heralds, or worse, slaves. Pawns in a game so vast it stretched across eons. We stopped calling it a war and started calling it what it was, a cycle. Back at the vein, new corridors had opened, reacting to Korra's discovery like a muscle twitching in the cold. Inside them, more symbols, more echoes. One wall showed carvings of Reaper-like shapes kneeling before massive spirals, creatures the size of moons, wreathed in flame. Another showed humanoid figures, us, maybe, reaching toward those same spirals, then burning. Everywhere, every time, burning. The historians called it the hollow pattern. The same story, told in bone and dust and blood. Civilization rises. It climbs. It builds. And then it reaches too far, touches the hollow, and gets devoured. The real horror? We were right on schedule. For weeks, Command argued. Do we keep fighting the Reapers? Do we change course? Is there even a point anymore? Some said yes. Some said no. Some just stared at the ceiling, waiting for something to come down. But out in the field, the soldiers didn't stop. They couldn't, because Reapers were still here, still burning, still killing. Even if they weren't the end, they were still the blade pressed to our throat. And so humanity did what it always does best. We fought, not for victory, not even for survival, but to matter, to leave a scar so deep the hollow would remember us. That's when Project Morningstar began. No records remain, only whispers. But here's what we know. It wasn't a weapon. It was a message, a pulse, a frequency, coded in every human tongue, every scream, every lullaby ever sung in the dark. Designed to be heard not by ears, but by whatever's listening beyond the stars. Some say it's still broadcasting. Others say it already got a response. All we know is this. Since the day that signal went live, the Reapers stopped sending new world enders. No new dread forms. No orbital purges. Just drones. Cold. Mechanical. Weak. As if they're stalling. Or retreating. Or waiting. Waiting for what? We don't know. But the sky feels different now. Heavier. Tighter. Like we're standing at the edge of something vast and cruel and old. The hollow is still there. Still silent. Still watching. And somewhere in that void, Korra Rin drifts. Frozen in time, eyes open, facing the stars that were never stars. We look up now not with hope, but with defiance. Because even if this story was never meant to have a happy ending, even if we're just another match struck in a long line of fire, we'll burn in our own way. Loud, bright, furious, and maybe, just maybe, long enough for someone else to see. In the quiet places of the world, in the forgotten corners of the dust, there's a kind of beauty. Not the kind you see in grand vistas or towering cities, but the kind you find in the margins, the cracks, the wilderness, the edges of history. After everything had burned, after the stars had turned hollow and humanity had learned how to survive in the dark, those were the places we clung to. The forgotten, the abandoned, the ones who had lost everything, but still had something left to give. They were called the Wolves of Dust, a ragtag alliance of survivors from every corner of Earth. Scavengers, nomads, rebels, those who knew what it meant to lose it all. But not all of them lost their will. No, these were the ones who refused to be erased. And though their numbers were few, their hearts beat like a wildfire that refused to go out. They weren't soldiers. They weren't even an army. But they had one thing that made them something more. A purpose. The Reapers had burned the cities. They had shattered the skies. But one thing they had underestimated was the power of the human spirit. And that spirit? It ran wild in the wolves. It started in the mountains. The craggy cliffs of the old Rockies, now silent, empty, and forgotten. But deep in those abandoned peaks, a story began to spread. A rumor, perhaps. A whisper. A fire started in the heart of an old military outpost. There are people who fight differently. They called them the Dustborn, because they had emerged from the ashes of a world long since lost. These were not the soldiers who fought on the front lines, not the ones who had been counted and measured. No, These were the ones who had crawled out from the ruins, who had learned how to make survival an art. They didn't need weapons. They didn't need technology. They needed their hands and their fire. It wasn't long before others found them. Survivors from every shattered colony, outcasts, runaways, old-world refugees, all found their way to the dust-born stronghold, scattered like wolves through the desolate wasteland. No one knew how long they had been waiting for something like this, for a call, for a reason to stop hiding, for a chance to fight again. And so, the wolves were born. They moved in the shadows of the old world, knowing every ruin, every cave, every hidden pass. They lived off scraps, tech scavenged from the bones of fallen cities, supplies taken from Reaper waste zones, anything that still held value in a world that no longer made sense. They were wild, unpredictable, and ferocious, and they had a leader. His name was Cashin Ward. Once a commander in the former UN fleet, Cashin had seen it all. He had stood before the first Reaper assault on Earth. And when it fell, when everything shattered and burned, he had made a choice. He refused to die. He refused to kneel. Cashin had nothing left to lose, but he had everything to fight for. When he found the wolves, they were still small, a handful of survivors trying to make do. Cashin changed that. He didn't tell them to fight. He didn't tell them to die. He told them to remember. "You think this is over?" he would say, looking them in the eyes. "You think the Reapers won because they burned your home? Because they crushed your family? No. No, this is our time. We don't fight because we're strong. We fight because we have nothing left to fear." They grew in strength, in number, in purpose. The wolves didn't have the luxury of conventional war. They didn't have fleets or battalions. But what they had was something far more dangerous: the will to strike when no one expected it. Their first raid was on a Reaper supply train, just a few dozen of them, sneaking through the craters of the Mojave Desert, barely visible to the eye, moving like ghosts under the cover of night. The Reapers didn't even know they were coming. Cashin had no plans, no grand strategies, just a handful of handmade bombs, a few long-range shooters, and a crew of wolves who had learned to think like predators. The strike hit like a lightning bolt. The Reapers tried to retaliate, but the wolves had already melted into the darkness, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. In the aftermath, the Reapers didn't just lose cargo. They lost a message that said, "We're still here. We're still fighting." The wolves became a symbol, not just of rebellion, but of resilience. They didn't make history. They wrote it, and their story spread like wildfire across Earth, Mars, every colony, every resistance base. But it wasn't just about battles. Not really. It was about legacy. When the wolves raided, they didn't just take supplies. They took memories, pieces of the old world that had been forgotten. Photos, letters, books, small things with small meanings, but things that mattered more in a world that had lost everything. Cashin understood that. He understood what had been taken from them. And so, in the depths of the Nevada desert, the wolves built their own home. A fortress of sand, stone, and salvage technology. But it wasn't just a home. It was a memory. They started carving into the walls. A story, a map of humanity's fight. Every raid, every victory, every small gesture of defiance. Cashin knew they might not live to see the end of the war. But he knew this. They would leave something behind. They would be remembered. It wasn't about winning. It was about standing. Standing against the tide. Standing against the darkness. Standing for what mattered when everything else had turned to ash. And the wolves? They were proud of that. Then came the day the Reapers took notice. They didn't just send a fleet. They sent a message. A massive dread form appeared over the wolves' territory. Not a ship, not a weapon, but a creature. A thing made of void and shadow, with eyes like burning coals, and a mouth that could swallow entire worlds. It stood there, staring, and in the distance, Cashin could feel its gaze. It wasn't coming for them. It was simply waiting. That was the moment the wolves knew. It wasn't about fighting the Reapers anymore. It was about making the Reapers remember. Remember that Earth had a history, that humanity had a spirit, and no matter what came next, it wasn't going to fade into the dark without leaving something behind. So the wolves of dust gathered for the last time. Not in fear, not in desperation, but in defiance. They gathered, knowing that their fight might not save the world, but it would save its story. As Cashin stood before his people for the final time, he said, "We might be outnumbered, outgunned, outmatched, but we're not out of fight. We are the last fire. And if we go out, we go out howling. The final battle was not a victory. It was not a loss. It was a story, their story, and it burned brighter than any star. The universe doesn't care. It doesn't care about us. It doesn't care about the blood we've spilled. It doesn't care about the promises we've made or the futures we've dreamt. It only keeps moving, like a tide that swallows everything in its path. We are but ripples, fleeting, temporary, but there's something about us, isn't there? Something that refuses to be erased. Something that fights even when the odds are too great. We've always fought, even when the stars grew cold and the heavens burned. Even when we were surrounded by silence. We refused to be forgotten. By the time we reached the final days of the war, the Reapers had nearly crushed us. There were no cities left, no governments, no armies. The survivors, the ones who didn't give up, and we were scattered across planets, moons, asteroids, wherever we could hide. We learned how to fight with nothing. We learned how to survive when survival didn't seem possible. But there was one place we hadn't given up on, one place we hadn't abandoned. The last city. They called it Elysium, a world on the verge of extinction, nestled on the edge of the galaxy, surrounded by desolation. It had once been a paradise, a shining example of human achievement. Now, it was a fortress, a reminder, a final stand. Elysium had survived everything. The Reaper assault, the famine, the plagues, the endless wars that had torn the galaxy apart. But it wasn't just about survival. It was about something more. It was about memory, the last echo of human civilization, standing in the face of oblivion. A place where stories were kept alive, where the ghosts of the past still whispered in the halls of museums and libraries, where the dead were honored, their names carved into stone. It was a place where we told ourselves that we would never forget the fire that made us who we are. But the Reapers, of course, had never forgotten, and they knew that if they destroyed Elysium, they would wipe out the last trace of us. We couldn't let that happen. Captain Lena Marks was the last leader of Elysium, a woman whose hands were calloused from years of pulling survivors out of the ashes. Her eyes had seen too many wars, too many deaths. But she wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. She knew Elysium was our last hope, and she would protect it with her life. Lena didn't have a grand strategy. She didn't have a fleet of soldiers or fleets of ships. She had us, the ones who had stayed behind, the ones who still remembered what it meant to fight for something greater than ourselves. Her plan wasn't to fight the Reapers head-on. She knew that would be a fool's errand. No, her plan was something more subtle, more human. The plan was to give the Reapers a reason to fear us, to remind them that no matter how much they took, no matter how much they destroyed, we would never stop. We would never stop fighting, and we would never give up. For the final battle, the Wolves of Dust joined forces with the survivors of Elysium. Cassian Ward, now older, more scarred, stood alongside Lena. The two of them had no illusions about victory. They had no grand hopes of turning the tide, but they had a shared understanding. They didn't need to win. They just needed to survive. The Reapers came for Elysium in full force. A fleet of dreadnoughts, each one a harbinger of destruction, appeared on the horizon. Their ships darkened the sky like vultures circling the last scraps of humanity. And we stood there, waiting. Lena stood in the command center, her fingers running over the console, her thoughts scattered in every direction. Her voice was calm when she spoke, but her heart was 1,000 miles away. She knew this could be the end, but she also knew there was no choice but to stand. Activate the signal. Her voice was steady, but there was something in it, something that made everyone pause. It's time. And so, they activated the signal. The Morning Star Pulse, a frequency coated with humanity's last memories. A song composed from every story, every lullaby, every battle cry, every song we had ever sung. We broadcast it through the stars, sending it out in every direction. A message to the Reapers, to anyone out there who could hear. We're still here. We're still fighting. The Reapers didn't understand it at first. They didn't know how to react. How could they? This was a war they didn't understand. It wasn't about conquest. It wasn't about domination. It was about something else, something that made them pause. And for one moment, just one fleeting moment, the Reapers faltered. And that's when we hit. Not with weapons, not with firepower, but with our spirit. We activated the planetary defenses, explosives, EMPs, old tech weaponry, repurposed and retooled. Cassian's wolves rode into the fray like ghosts, their ships streaking through the sky. The survivors from Elysium fought with every last breath. They didn't care about winning. They didn't care about glory. They fought for what mattered. They fought for the last echo of humanity. The battle was brutal, violent, unforgiving. But amidst the chaos, something incredible happened. The Reapers retreated, not all of them, but enough. And for the first time in years, the skies cleared. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. But humanity had won a victory that was more than just survival. We had reminded the universe who we were, what we had been. We had refused to fade into silence. We had sent the Reapers a message. We are the echoes of the last dawn, and we will not be forgotten. In the aftermath, as the dust settled and the fires burned out, Elysium stood, still standing, not untouched, not invincible, but still there. Because no matter how hard they tried, the Reapers couldn't take away the one thing that made us human: our refusal to be silenced, our refusal to disappear. Lena stood on the balcony of Elysium's last bastion, staring up at the sky, now clear of Reaper ships. The wind ruffled her hair, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a fleeting, fragile peace. It wouldn't last. Nothing ever did. But in this moment, humanity had left its mark, and that was enough. When the end comes, it doesn't always look the way you expect it to. It isn't the sudden collapse of everything. It's the quiet moments, the stillness that follows after all the noise has faded. It's the understanding that something has shifted, maybe for good, maybe for bad, and that the world has changed irrevocably. And maybe, just maybe, the last light you see is the one you've been fighting for all along. The Reapers had failed, or so we thought. They hadn't destroyed us. Not entirely, but they had never been the true enemy. Not really. They were just the harbingers of something older, something larger, a force that existed not in the stars, but in the spaces between them. We had learned that the hard way. Elysium, once a city of hope, now stood as a memorial to everything humanity had fought for. A reminder that we had faced oblivion and refused to bow. But the skies were still cold. The universe was still vast. And somewhere, in the darkest corners of space, something was watching. In the aftermath of the last battle, Captain Lena Marks stood on the edge of the city, looking out over the wreckage. The skyline, once a symbol of human achievement, now reflected only the fading light of a dying star. It had been a victory, yes, but victory had never been the point. Survival? Yes, but survival was just the beginning of the story. And Lena knew that. She had always known that. The signal was still there, the morning star pulse, echoing through the void, telling the universe that we weren't gone, that we had a story that couldn't be erased. But who was listening? Who would hear us? Now that the war had reached its final act, Elysium had been humanity's last bastion, but it was no longer a city of hope. It was a graveyard, not for the dead, but for the dreams we'd once held. The dream of a future where we had conquered the stars. The dream of a world where we could thrive in peace. That dream had slipped away, piece by piece, in the wake of the Reapers' invasion. And now, only the cold reality remained. But Lena wasn't one to dwell on the past. She turned away from the broken skyline and looked out toward the horizon, where a faint light flickered in the distance. It wasn't much, a small, fragile light in the distance, but it was something. It had been months since the last battle, months since the last Reaper dreadnought had been destroyed, months since we had stopped fighting. But Lena knew, deep in her heart, that the war wasn't truly over. It was only the beginning. The last light wasn't a symbol of peace. It wasn't a beacon of hope. It was a warning. The morning star pulse had done something, something the Reapers hadn't expected. It had called to them, not the Reapers themselves, but to something else. The beings that had existed before them, the ones who had shaped the void. And now they were coming to see us for themselves. Lena didn't speak. She didn't have to. The moment the last light appeared on the horizon, we all understood. The question wasn't whether humanity would survive. It was whether humanity would ever have the chance to be remembered. The skies opened, not with fire, but with something far worse. Not death, not destruction, but judgment. A shape appeared in the sky, not a ship, but an idea made manifest, vast, unfathomable, like the universe itself had grown eyes and decided to look. It moved slowly, methodically, like a storm cloud of unimaginable size and gravity. And we knew, without a doubt, that this was it. Lena's heart raced as the city fell silent. The people who had gathered in the streets, rebels, survivors, families, felt it too. It wasn't fear. It wasn't awe. It was something simpler, something older. It was the feeling of being seen, the feeling of being weighed. And the question was no longer whether we would be destroyed. The question was, would we be remembered? The last light blinked in the sky like a dying star. The horizon burned with energy as the shape in the heavens began to speak. Not in words, not in sound, but in thought, in presence. It was the feeling of 1,000 voices, 1,000 ages, all whispering in unison. And then, a single word echoed through the air. Why? It was not a question from an alien race. It was not a question from some distant cosmic force. It was a question from the void itself. A question that demanded an answer. Why had humanity fought so hard? Why had we risked everything? Why had we refused to die? Lena didn't hesitate. She stood tall. She didn't speak. She showed them, her hand raised toward the light. A simple gesture. And in that gesture, humanity's story was told. Not in grand speeches, not in victories, but in our refusal to give up. For the first time in history, the universe heard it. Not just the stars, not just the galaxies, but the void itself. And the last light, once cold and distant, now flared. The question didn't end with doubt. It ended with understanding. The shape in the sky shifted. It turned, fading into the vastness of space. It left, but we had done it. We had been seen. And the universe, whatever ancient force had been watching, understood. Lena watched the light fade as the people of Elysium gathered around her. Their faces were weary, haunted by loss. But there was something else there now. It wasn't hope. It wasn't certainty. But it was peace. The world had burned. The universe had judged us. And we had stood. We had stood for the last time. We were the last light, the last echo, the last memory. And the stars would carry our story forever.